The age of Napoleon is a brief but profoundly important time in European history. So profound that 2 centuries later, historians continue to seek explanation for the Napoleonic Wars, a string of conflicts that killed 4 million soldiers and civilians between 1798 and 1815. Every nation in Europe would experience loss of life and extreme hardships as the Old World made way for the Industrial Revolution and social changes, conditions that would impact the future of Europe and the world. Napoleon Bonaparte has been both revered and disliked for his part in these events. Soldiers have admired him as a great strategist, a leader of great determination. Historians have criticized him as an egotistical and power-hungry leader. On August 15, 1769, Napoleon Bonaparte was born on Corsica, a Mediterranean island off the west coast of Italy and south of France. His parents were prominent in Corsican society. About the same time as the birth of Napoleon, Corsica was ceded to France by the ruling Genoese. Napoleon's father, Carlo, joined forces with Pasquale Paoli in revolt of the French occupation of his homeland. However, when the revolution failed, Carlo Bonaparte came to terms with the French and earned favored person status. This enabled him to send his oldest sons, Joseph and Napoleon, to France to be educated. His early teachers soon realized that he was an intelligent and eager student. By the age of 16, he joined the French artillery, and under the tutelage of the leading gunners of the 18th century, his talents were launched. Little did anyone know that this would lead to a military career often compared to great generals such as Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Genghis Khan. A unique combination of hard work, bravery, political connections, and being born in a turbulent age impacted Napoleon's early success. In 1789, the people of France rose up in revolution against their reigning monarch, King Louis XVI, in an effort to seize control of the government. When the king resisted this move by the people, an angry crowd stormed the royal prison known as the Bastille and destroyed it. By 1791, the 22-year-old Napoleon was a first lieutenant in the French artillery. He also joined the Jacobin Club, a debating society that favored a constitutional monarchy. He soon became its president, making speeches against nobles and bishops. During this time, he officially changed his name to a more French spelling and devoted himself to the military success of France. His decisive actions and bravery in wars against Prussia and Austria only furthered his visibility in the French military. In January 1793, the French Revolution took a significant turn with the beheading of King Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette. This was quickly followed by an equally troubling era, the Reign of Terror under the leadership of Maximilien de Robespierre, who would dominate the country for the next 2 years. 25,000 people would be executed as enemies of the French Republic during this brutal era. Meanwhile, the ever-energetic Napoleon actively led skirmishes that drove British naval forces from the city of Toulon and continued to gain favor in the ranks of the military. However, as the controversial Robespierre lost power, conservative forces temporarily arrested Napoleon because of his association with them. For the moment, this accelerating career seemed uncertain. Bonaparte remained in Paris in 1795 when the National Convention submitted a new constitution. The Royalists, hoping that they would soon be able to restore the monarchy to power, instigated a revolt to prevent the legislative decrees from being enacted. During this course of events, Napoleon emerged as commander of the forces and led the move to stop the rebels. Successful once again, Bonaparte became the commander of the army and consequently aware of every political development of France's Directory government of 1795. His happiness was only further enhanced by his marriage to Josephine de Beauharnais on March 9th. But rather than a honeymoon, the ambitious Napoleon arrived in Italy 2 days after the wedding to begin a new campaign. At the headquarters in Nice, Bonaparte found an army of malnourished and ill-equipped troops. Believing in one of his maxims that an army marches on its stomach, he offered words of encouragement.
Soldiers, you are naked, badly fed. Rich provinces and great towns will be in your power, and in them you will find honor, glory, and wealth. Soldiers of Italy, will you be wanting in courage and steadfastness?
With the spirit of this proclamation, Napoleon led his men into battle. Between 1794 and 1797, the series of campaigns in Italy wrought several defeats and many narrowly won battles. Under his direction, the troops persevered at important sites, such as the three-day Battle of Arcola, the Battle for the Bridge of Lodi, and the Siege of Mantua. By the end of 1797, the Italian campaign culminated with the French army's advance into Austria. Austrian forces were spread throughout all of northern Italy and southern Austria. Bonaparte did not feel that he could concentrate his troops effectively and was forced to halt his expansion. Rather than risk defeat, the French then asked for a peace treaty. The Treaty of Campo Formio confirmed French control in parts of northern Italy and the establishment of French satellites. In the spring of 1797, the tireless Napoleon commenced the Egyptian campaign against the British, and by July 21st, he had won the Battle of the Pyramids. 10 days later, British Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the French fleet in the Battle of the Nile. The British would be a tireless foe for the French. From March through June of 1798, Napoleon marched towards Syria, but eventually retreated back to Egypt. The Egyptian campaign would not be one of the most stellar moments in Napoleon's career. Cultural differences and lack of naval superiority against the British contributed to a near disaster. In the autumn of 1799, the Directory government was faced with increasing political strife. Instinctively, Napoleon returned to France and to rumors of a coup. As the Directory's authority was very weak, Napoleon and his supporters were able to secure him the position of first consul. The political drama resulted in paving the avenues for Napoleon to reorganize the government, laws, and educational system of France. Napoleon believed that efficient government depended on control from the center, and in this case, the center was Napoleon. Meanwhile, the Austrians were regaining territory in Italy. So in addition to domestic issues, Napoleon targeted himself for the reconquest of Italy. During this time, he firmly established himself as the master of France as a military dictator. Napoleon was next designated first consul for life, a permanent role of leadership with the Directory functioning much as the U.S. Congress does. In this role, Napoleon was confirmed the central politician and military manager of France. With the French Revolution over, the Napoleonic Wars began as Britain and France blocked each other's trade. Among his political moves, Napoleon sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States. For the United States, the purchase opened westward expansion. For the French, the transaction netted Napoleon $15 million in funds for his war coffers. In 1804, the Napoleonic Code was introduced, a complete and systematic code that had no precedent. Napoleon was known to be a clear, concise writer and asked that the old-fashioned statutes be rewritten in language that could be understood by everyone. He often attended the meetings of the Code Committee to assure strength and clarity in the rewritten civil laws. This code was so impressive that it's considered to be the model of civil law for dozens of countries in today's world. The Code Napoleon revised over 14,000 decrees that had been passed under the revolutionary government and simplified them into one unified set of laws. The code had several key concepts at its core. Equality of all in the eyes of the law. No recognition of privileges of birth. Freedom of religion. Separation of church and state. Freedom to work in an occupation of one's own choice. In all, the Code Napoleon represented a compromise that retained religious freedom and laws that allowed poor farmers to purchase land they had worked on, ending forever the feudalism that had prevailed before the Revolution. It took until 1810 to complete the code. The resulting document, though harsh in some of its penalties, meant that at last the French people in all parts of the country and from all stations of life were treated equally under the law. Napoleon astutely secured his power with the drafting of the Napoleonic Code. The majority of the people supported him, and he ascended to the title of Crowned Emperor of France with little difficulty in 1804. Wanting to be consecrated by the Pope at his coronation, Pope Pius VII agreed to attend the ceremony, but at the last minute the new emperor took the crown from the Pope and placed it on his own head. Napoleon continued to wage war and became a larger-than-life figure in military history. Well known for both his battles and his military maxims, Napoleon articulated his value of speed and time.
It may be that in the future I may lose a battle, but I shall never lose a minute.
For a period of time from 1803 to 1805, Napoleon had only the British to fight. But he could not hope for victory without landing an army on England. Crossing the English Channel would be a daunting task for the French. So the inferior French Navy sought an alliance with the Spanish to bolster their strength at sea. Yet even this joint effort against the British would fail. In the greatest naval engagement of the Napoleonic Wars, a skilled British fleet defeated the French-Spanish fleet in the Battle of Trafalgar. As the French admiral, Pierre de Villeneuve, led the combined navy against the British blockade, his entire fleet was destroyed. His only success was that the highly respected British admiral, Horatio Nelson, was killed in the battle. With their victory, the British eliminated the danger of invasion by the French. They also succeeded in organizing a new anti-French coalition of European countries. Napoleon's greatest triumph loomed ahead. 2 months after the loss at sea during the Battle of Trafalgar, Napoleon's tactical genius would be engaged in the Battle of Austerlitz. Sometimes referred to as the Battle of the Three Emperors because Tsar Alexander I led the Russians, Francis I the Austrians, and Napoleon led the French, it illustrated the more often than not superior strategy of Napoleon. He carefully concealed the bulk of his men behind some high ground in the center of his position. This left his right flank appearing weak, thus attracting a mass attack of the enemy forces just as he had anticipated. Then at his signal, the hiding troops burst forth, swiftly encircling the Russians and Austrians. Suddenly, the enemy realized that they were under attack from all sides and fled unwittingly toward a frozen lake. With relentless aggressiveness, Napoleon's artillery broke up the ice, sending many to a freezing death. By late in the afternoon, the battle was over. The next day, Napoleon told his army,
I will lead you back to France. There, my people will welcome you with joy, and you will only have to say, I was at the Battle of Austerlitz, for people to exclaim, behold a hero.
Austerlitz has been called Napoleon's masterpiece. Perhaps in no other victory did his strategy succeed with such clockwork precision. It also minimized any previous losses or missteps and restored the Napoleon mystique as master of the entire continent. Austria was knocked out of the war and forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty that gave Napoleon influence over Italy and large parts of Germany. Meanwhile, Russia was forced to retreat to its own borders. Indeed, by the following year, no army in Europe felt capable of competing successfully against France. With that, he proceeded to redraw boundaries at his will. At its height, the empire of the French included modern-day Belgium, the Netherlands, Corsica, the Papal States, and the Balkans from the Danube River down to Montenegro. France directly controlled Spain, Switzerland, the kingdoms of Italy and Naples, a confederation of 300 small German states, and Poland. The weakened states of Austria, Prussia, Denmark, and Norway were allied with France. Only Portugal, Sweden, and Russia were not part of the empire, nor were they in a position to dispute its power. Across the Channel sat England. The English refused to fight the French on land, and Napoleon had failed when opposing them at sea. Napoleon settled on economic warfare. He sought to stifle the British economy by blocking all trade. For the blockade to succeed, it had to be enforced fully throughout Europe. From the outset, no foolproof plan enabled France to plug the leaks in port cities, especially in Portugal, an old British ally. As British goods continued to filter onto the continent, the embers of nationalism were being fanned in the conquered countries. Subsequently, in 1809, his forces suffered defeat in Spain and Portugal. Despite these seeming figures, Napoleon was at the zenith of his power and achievement. He drew boundaries and named the countries. And soon the conquered people began to think of themselves as united against the French. At the end of 1810, Napoleon's empire appeared secure. A civil war in Spain seemed but a distraction. England still opposed him, but he held on to Europe. France was the most powerful nation. Napoleon was now in his early 40s with no heir. He became concerned with his lack of a successor, no son to pass the torch to. So in December 1809, he divorced Josephine for failing to provide him with a son. He then chose Marie-Louise, an Austrian princess, 18 years old and healthy, to be his wife. 2 years later, she would bear him his only child, a son. Napoleon always believed that a general had about 10 years at the top of his profession. After that, he would lose some of his strategic abilities. Towards the latter part of the first decade of the 1800s, Napoleon found himself using alternative maneuver tactics. Missing were the quick and brilliant military moves. Instead, as critics cited, he replaced his exceptional battle moves with numeric superiority and consequently higher casualty rates. Huge armies could simply not operate with the same speed as smaller forces that had been so instrumental in his early conquests. By 1811, his stellar showing began to dim at home. A serious depression hit France, and Napoleon was forced to relax import restrictions of British goods onto the continent. This in turn outraged the Russians, who had cooperated with Napoleon's banning of British goods. The opening of trade upset Tsar Alexander I, who blatantly ignored correspondence from Napoleon. The combative emperor readied for yet another war with Russia. Always before, Napoleon had lured the Russians onto his terrain. This time, however, the Russians retreated deep into their vast countryside. Alexander said, "We will leave it to our climate, to our winter, to wage our war." Napoleon amassed 650,000 soldiers for the invasion of Russia. The largest army he had ever assembled included men from his conquered regions, men who were not happy about fighting for France. He based his campaign strategy on sheer numbers. He would march into Russia and overwhelm the Tsar's army. In June, the French made their move into Russia. Expecting the Russians to meet them in open battle, Napoleon was greatly disappointed as the Russians embarked on a seemingly endless retreat. By August, the French soldiers found themselves deeper into Russia than they ever expected to be. In addition, the battle line was 700 miles wide, and yet there still had been no significant battle with the enemy. On September 7th, Napoleon marched toward Moscow with 150,000 remaining men. At Borodino, about 70 miles outside Moscow, the Russian army stood its ground. It was an indecisive battle. The cost was heavy for Napoleon's men. The Tsar's army withdrew while it was still a viable fighting team. 1 week later, the French entered Moscow, but the city was deserted. Looting and arson of the city ensued. Despite the efforts of the French firefighters, the city blazed for 5 days and was virtually destroyed. Napoleon blamed the city's governor for ordering the city's destruction and offered Tsar Alexander a truce. Again, Alexander did not reply. The Russians continued to refuse to engage in battle. They chose to taunt the French with sniping and hit-and-run raids. They scorched the land, destroying everything possible as the French proceeded toward them. And while Napoleon waited for word from Alexander, the season grew later. On October 8th, he finally ordered a retreat that would prove to be disastrous. The French troops began retracing their steps through already ravaged land. With no food and no appropriate winter uniforms, they fell victim to cruel winds and dropping temperatures. Cold, disease, and starvation became the victors. Napoleon marched beside his men in a vain effort to lift their spirits. Of the original 650,000 men, only 40,000 survived. Napoleon refused to surrender while the opposition's coalition strengthened. As Napoleon said,
"From the sublime to the ridiculous is but a step."
And so it was by 1813, as the armies of Europe joined forces to crush Napoleon in France. Battles against the Russian-Prussian coalition, threats from Spain, surprise strategies from the Swedes left Napoleon facing a triple threat. No longer could he concentrate his men into one massive showing of strength. The cooperation within the European coalition was unparalleled. Waging wars on 3 fronts divided the troops into weaker groups. In addition, Their leader could not be in three places at once. The disadvantages splintered his legions and left France vulnerable to defeat. On October 16, 1813, the key debacle of his career was to unfold, the Battle of Leipzig, often called the Battle of Nations because so many countries were involved. Napoleon's 160,000 men faced 320,000 coalition troops at Leipzig in southeast Germany. The first day was victorious for the French, but the second day was not to be theirs. Undoubtedly, the loss of soldiers and ammunition were severe. The Allies were strongly banded together in their opposition. Perhaps the years of battle were finally taking a toll on the leader. For whatever reason, Napoleon made an uncharacteristic hesitation on the second day of battle. Hoping for a peace agreement, he chose to wait and not to use the time to regroup and reorganize his army. On the third day, the French troops were crushed. The war was lost. At every juncture, the great empire appeared to be falling apart. In Italy, in Spain, in Holland, the army was defeated. At home, a great economic depression resulted in bankruptcies that were blamed on the emperor. The previously docile Legislative Assembly was now demanding peace. Many who had cheered for Napoleon's every deed for more than a decade now cursed his name. The Allies further stirred the French people's discontent by declaring that their enemy was not the French people, but Napoleon himself. For the next few months, Napoleon was confronted with foes, both domestically and internationally. Still, he declared that he and he alone would save France. The Allies continued their advances into France, and even Napoleon was said to have wondered if perhaps he had made war too long. On March 30th, 1814, he raced to Paris to lead resistance, only to learn that the Allies had captured the city earlier that day. Unwilling to see his city destroyed, he turned away. 2 days later, the French Senate deposed him. Finally, on April 11th, he was forced to abdicate the throne and was exiled for life to Elba, an 86-square-mile island off the coast of Italy. On May 30th, the Treaty of Paris restored peace to Europe, reduced France to its 1792 boundaries, and placed Louis XVIII, brother of the decapitated Louis XVI, on the French throne. The Allies felt compelled to return to the ancient regime. They also agreed to join together in a Congress to decide the fate of the recovered territories. On October 1st, 1814, the Congress of Vienna restored the old monarchies and established an unsteady balance of power in Europe. While political manipulations and disharmony distracted the powers of Europe, an unhappy Napoleon found life in Elba unbearable. Indeed, a brief respite from command seemed to restore his energies. In France, Louis XVIII was installed to the throne. Old hatreds were revived and resistance was organized. Napoleonic war veterans did not want the monarch. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon escaped Elba and headed for Paris. A gingerly chosen path took him through areas still loyal to him, and his forces rejoined him. At Grenoble, the French Army's division commander sent 500 troops to stop him. He is said to have shouted,
"If there is among you a soldier who would like to kill his emperor, here I am."
The soldiers lowered their weapons and cheered him. At every mile, his army grew. King Louis now felt the pressure to leave France. Napoleon embodied the spirit of the revolution, not the fallen emperor, but enthusiasm ebbed fast. At Waterloo, the British, under the leadership of the Duke of Wellington, confronted Napoleon's legions in a savage battle. As the French were on the brink of victory over the British, Prussian Field Marshal Prince von Blücher arrived on the scene with fresh reinforcements. The Battle of Waterloo was soon over. Napoleon had fought his last battle and lost. Following the defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon considered living in the United States, which would have caused problems for the young country. He was arrested and deported to the remote Atlantic island of St. Helena. On the island, he was guarded night and day, though he was free to move about, though he surely seemed abandoned. His wife and son remained distant and busy with their own lives. He further secluded himself by confining his activities to his home. Though he enjoyed writing and conversation a great deal, it was not an existence that he adjusted to well. At the end of 1817, Napoleon showed signs of an illness that may have been an ulcer or stomach cancer. Napoleon Bonaparte eventually died on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51. Anti-Napoleon literature proliferated immediately afterwards, but in death, as in life, his supporters would rise to his cause. The legend of Napoleon encapsulates efforts and achievements that to this day are debated. Under his leadership, several major reforms stand out and are important even today. A national education system, fiscal reform, restored limited rights to the Catholic Church, a new civil code. In the aftermath of Napoleon, historians credit his destruction of feudalism and redrawing of European boundaries for encouraging nationalism and for the creation of larger, more powerful states than had existed. Furthermore, as a military leader, he was clearly unequaled in his own time. His accomplishments are studied and discussed by generations of military experts, his maxims memorized and scrutinized. Accused by some of being a warmonger, he also negotiated generous treaties when possible and made friends of former enemies. He is quoted as saying, "A victory has 100 fathers, a defeat is an orphan." And so it was for him in his final days on St. Helena in 1821. Nearly 2 decades later, his legend found new listeners when in December 1840, 100,000 people lined the streets of Paris in freezing temperatures to watch a procession honoring the exiled leader who was to be reburied on the grounds that he loved so dearly. It has been said that though Napoleon was the greatest genius of his time, he never acquired the crown of greatness. But as Napoleon wrote, "The pursuit of detail is the religion of perfection. Therein lies history's fascination with the man and the legend."